So our second speaker will be today Enikő Bollobás, who is sitting on my right. And to mention some of her achievements is again somewhat personal on my part, because with her and some other colleagues, we together founded the first Department of American Studies in Hungary in 1989. But then immediately the changes came. We had already by then participated in the opposition movements, and Enikő became Deputy Chief of Mission at the end of 1990, I guess.
June.
The June of 1990 in Washington, of our embassy in Washington. First counselor and Deputy Chief of Mission. And I think in late 92 or early 93, you came back to Budapest and you became head of the policy planning department in the foreign ministry. So we have been doing lots of things together. After that excursion into politics, she went back to Eötvös Loránd University, and she just recently, I think, resigned, or actually terminated her post as chair of the American Studies Department. Her research in the last 15 years, I might say 20, more and more drifted toward gender studies, and definitely very much to the study of the role of women in societies, which goes beyond, I think, the study of literature, if I'm right. And I think that for this reason, we have asked you with John to speak about the situation of women in communism. Please, Enikő, go ahead.
Thank you very much. Well, my interest in women has been constant for the past, I can't even say 30, 40 years. I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for the Danube Institute, but I'm also very happy to be in this hall, in the home of the Jesuits. And it's not even the first time that the topic of women connects me to the Jesuits, because just a few weeks ago I gave a talk to Hungarian, next door, I think, within this same institution, to some outstanding students. It's kind of the École Supérieure in Hungary that the Jesuits have organized. Egy szakkollégium itt a szomszédban. But more interestingly, it was back in 1982, let's say, that I was invited to a radio program on feminism, and my conversational partner was Professor Tamás Nyíri, who was the most outstanding Jesuit professor, who was later to become the dean or president, rector of the theological seminary of the Catholic theological. Anyway, he was an incredibly outstanding person, and incredibly open-minded person, and much more radical than I ever was. So I always describe myself as a conservative feminist, where Professor Nyíri, he was a radical feminist. And I'm happy to give you examples later in private, because I really cannot talk about those topics in public that he had no problem talking about. Anyway, I'm going to address some issues concerning the situation of women in communist Hungary, and somewhat in post-communist Hungary. I want to show that this situation fitted into the whole structure of lies that we lived about equality and emancipation, and within the framework of multiple patriarchy, if such a thing exists, patriarchy multiplied. Anyway, first some general points that I'm going to make. One, women in Central and Eastern Europe were affected by the double legacy of pre-1945 patriarchy and post-1945 communist traditions, but communist patriarchal traditions. This really is my thesis, that no matter no matter who was in power, patriarchy survived. It was untouchable. So too, the social benefits women enjoyed during communism only strengthened already existing patriarchal mentalities. And 3, women had huge difficulties in meeting new challenges of freedom after the regime change because of this double legacy, which brought about a double political and gender dependency on both state and men. The problem of women in these communist countries was complex in more than one way. Not only were women victims of communism's totalitarian grip, but also of the patriarchal traditions widespread in other parts of Europe too. So they were not really unique to Hungary. It was easy to misapprehend and misinterpret this double legacy, especially the way the 4.5 decades of communism created their own double twist on the institutions of patriarchy. Pre-1945, Central and Eastern European societies were clearly patriarchal, offering limited choices to women, stressing traditional feminine ideals. True, Western societies, Western Europe and the US, also revealed many symptoms of their own patriarchies. I just want to remind you of this very successful Netflix series, Mad Men. Probably none of you have seen it, but I recommend that you do if you want to see what American patriarchy was like in the early 60s. Everyday patriarchy. So the difference, however, is that in the West of the 1960s, patriarchy was substantially dismantled by the civil rights movement, itself strengthened by a long history of women's movement. East of the Iron Curtain, on the other hand, the 1960s were not the 60s in that sense. These 60s were characterized by the tightening of police control and the lack of any civil rights politicization whatsoever. I remember very distinctly October 23, 1966. We were just coming out with my school friends. We were just coming out from our dance school. And, we came out in flocks from our school. We were there by the dozens. And the police immediately came up to us and told us to disperse. We are not supposed to gather in groups. And we didn't even realize. Only then did
sorry,
we
you have
realize.
to mention the reason, perhaps.
Sorry?
You have to mention the reason why October 23.
Okay,
Third.
October 23rd, 1966 was the 10th anniversary of the 1956 revolution, for those of you for whom it was, sorry, yes. Here, the 1960s was not the decade of emergent feminism, demands for social equality, or the critique of racism and sexism. At best, our 1960s were characterized by a belated disillusionment in communism among the intellectuals, among leftist intellectuals, which disillusionment was triggered by the Prague events of 1968, not the actual uprising, but the crushing by Warsaw Pact tanks, by its crushing, occurring 12 years after the Hungarian Revolution of '56, which was a landmark historical event with the potential of many of revealing the ugly underbelly of the communist system. So the real 60s had to wait until the 1990s, for after the fall of communism and its totalitarian regimes, the fall of its totalitarian regimes. And during this time, the pre-World War II patriarchy became only more solid in Eastern Europe. surviving as an undercurrent to what looked like on the surface as emancipation. This really is my thesis, that communist emancipation was anything but emancipation, only a more solid, more solidified form of patriarchy. True, state socialism's own women's lib did happen, yet in truth it was anything but liberation. It was rather one last gasp of paternalistic state socialism, beautifully resonating with pre-war mentalities. Ultimately, this socialist women's lib left behind a muted culture of non-liberated women, as we could see them all over post-colonial Eastern Europe after the regime change. Observers, especially in the 1970s and 80s, often misunderstood the status of women in Central Europe. Visitors got the impression that women looked very Western in Prague, Bratislava, Warsaw, and Budapest. They dressed well, looked well, were educated, led a semi-Western lifestyle. What could not be visible to short-term visitors, however, was how much time, money, and energy had to be spent in keeping up this seemingly Western, but still immensely modest lifestyle, which was no more than the facade of Western living. Nor was it apparent to what degree they lived in a communist country with patriarchal roots. And there's another reason why communism's long-lasting damage in the social fabric was not given proper estimation. Women, along with other marginal groups of post-communism, were of a muted culture. Most women in Eastern Europe had to accept their woman's lot as a series of natural catastrophes, where passivity and patience were the best or only survival strategy, quietly standing aside and waiting for the storm to pass. Eastern Europeans did not possess a vocabulary of political concepts when civil rights and liberties were curbed. No political discourse was available with which to articulate their gender-specific grievances. That is why the myths were never contested or critiqued in public, or the supposed benefits that women enjoyed in communist societies, such as full employment, free health care, maternity leave, and cheap abortion, were not challenged. Not that we believed everything, for we knew well enough that these benefits only sounded appealing to foreign observers, to whom these words had different and much more positive meanings. In Hungarian, as well as Czech, Slovak, Polish, or Russian, these words sounded pitiful, cheap, poor, gloomy, because that was the reality they evoked. When we heard about free healthcare, for example, we did not picture an American hospital, but an overcrowded, undermanned, under-equipped, underdeveloped third world hospital in Eastern Europe, where social security costs, among the highest in Europe, did not actually cover hospital fees, where doctors and nurses had to be tipped for basic services. Or when we heard about maternity leave, we knew how much this benefit paid and how the practice generated underachievement. Only later did we become fully aware of the fact that these communist accomplishments only proved to be myths. The myth of full employment put women into underachieving jobs. The myth of free healthcare left them with rapidly deteriorating health and a complete lack of health awareness. The myth of social benefits strengthened patriarchal mentalities. Hungarian women have paid dearly for these so-called benefits. They paid by perpetuating patriarchy under the disguise of communist ideology. As a feminist, I have been extremely skeptical about the supposedly benevolent social benefits of communism, because they bred a political climate of dependence. They strengthened patriarchal mentalities about women's domestic priorities, the male imperative of achieving, politics as an exclusively manly sport, women's worth outside the home versus in the family. Communism's social welfare was a blessing in disguise, strengthening patriarchal values of male dominance, female dependency, and female domesticity. It perpetuated the wage gap and the occupational segregation of women, sent achievement-based values to an unreachable distance. Communism favored those who accepted a uniform and monolithic society, but stigmatized those who subscribed to identity, difference, diversity. So my point is there is an overlay of patriarchal mentalities in post-communism, an overlay of pre-war, pre-World War II, and post-World War II patriarchal mentalities. Moreover, and this patriarchy is not all that different from that patriarchy. Let me illustrate my point with a recent case of sexual harassment that has been in the news lately, much in the news lately. It concerns a theater director called László Marton, who was a very powerful man for 50 years, let's say, in the entertainment world, artistic theater, movie world. Some weeks ago, an actress came forward accusing him of having sexually harassing her. This brought about an avalanche of similar accusations, now over a dozen women claiming the same. Mr. Marton abused his professional power, using his position in the hierarchy to forcefully win women. It can happen everywhere, you might say that, and it does. What's unique to Hungary in this is how male commentators have responded. I shouldn't say unanimously, but kind of are in agreement. What took them so long, they ask. The other one is asking, what do you expect? It's the theater world, where bodies work together, generating desire in a healthy male. Then another one would say, but weren't the women very provocative? Didn't they bring it on to themselves? Another one would say, is this really necessary? Mr. Marton does not deserve this witch hunt. He is such a good theater director. He is exceptional, an exceptional mind with an exceptional career behind him. Doesn't his exceptional intellect grant him special treatment? So it seems that in this very divided country, where everyone is politically either one side, where one camp will never agree with the other on anything, one issue has emerged that enjoys the agreement of both camps, articulated or silent, on who is responsible, who is the responsible party in cases of sexual harassment, or on whether some men are not more equal than others. I believe this case beautifully illustrates the survival of patriarchal communist values, pre-war and communist patriarchal values in Hungary, left and right alike. Thank you very much.
My question regards the contacts and the existence of a feminist movement in Hungary, and whether there were contacts with feminist movements at the time of the rise of the feminists from the 1970s onwards, and whether there was any kind of attempt, I don't know whether you heard, to explain that the situation was not half as rosy as it was pictured out to be.
Thank you very much. No, not in the 70s. And later, in the late mid-80s, from the mid-80s on, mid-late 80s, when, yes, they did get in touch with us. We had, I happened to organize the first one. We called ourselves Hungarian Feminists, and it was a university thing with my students and colleagues, and but it had a good sounding name, and indeed we got lots and lots of invitations where we could, to conferences where we could talk about this, and we wrote, yes, we did publish some too, yes. But it was very strange because, it was expected from the West that feminism should be a leftist thing. And then it turned out that in an East European bloc country, Eastern Bloc country, feminism retained its revolutionary fervor or resistance or oppositional flavor, but it was an oppositional movement to socialism or communism.
What you called like that?
What?
What you called socialism?
Whatever you called it, yes, which was called socialism, which was the communist years. So it was a very mixed up and very tricky situation.